I was sitting in a diner on a Tuesday morning, the kind of Tuesday where nothing is supposed to happen, when a man I had never seen before slid into the booth across from me, looked at the photograph in my hands, and said, "I know who that boy is." I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I had been carrying that photo for 31 years. Let me back up. My name is not important right now. What matters is that I'm 64 years old, I live in Dayton, Ohio, I spent 32 years working for the County Water Authority, and I have a son I haven't seen since he was 4 years old. His name is Connor. He disappeared on a Saturday in October 1993. My wife, his mother Joanne, had taken him to the park 3 blocks from our house. The kind of neighborhood where you don't lock your doors. The kind of park where every parent knows every other parent. She turned around for what she swore was less than a minute. She was picking up a juice box that had rolled under the bench. When she looked up, he was gone. What followed was the kind of nightmare that doesn't end. It just changes shape. The police searched. The FBI got involved within 48 hours because my father-in-law, Joanne's dad, was a federal circuit court judge. He had put people away. Serious people. The kind who hold grudges across decades. For a long time, investigators believed Connor's disappearance was connected to a case my father-in-law had presided over the year before, a labor racketeering conviction that had sent 4 men to federal prison, men with families, men who had made very specific statements in open court about what happens to people who cross them. Nothing was ever proven. Connor's case went cold inside of 3 years. By then, Joanne and I were barely speaking. Not because we blamed each other. We were past that stage, which is somehow worse. We had just each folded inward, like paper left in the rain. She started going to a grief counselor in Yellow Springs. I started working longer hours. By 1999, we were divorced, not with anger, just with exhaustion. She remarried in 2004. A decent man, a high school football coach named Walt. I was glad for her. I genuinely was. I attended the wedding and sat in the back row and cried quietly when no one was looking, and it had nothing to do with jealousy. It had to do with the empty chair that had been in my chest for 11 years. I never remarried. I'm not saying that as some romantic gesture toward Connor's memory. I just never found a reason to try again. I had my work, I had my Thursday night bowling league, I had my sister Patrice who called me every Sunday whether I wanted her to or not. Life was small, but it was mine. Every October, on the anniversary of the day he vanished, I would take out the photograph. It was taken 3 weeks before he disappeared. Connor in a little orange jacket standing in the front yard holding a plastic pumpkin, squinting at the sun. He had a gap between his 2 front teeth. He had just learned to whistle through it and thought that was the greatest trick in the world. I would sit with that photo and I would think, he would be 35 now. 35. Older than I was when he was born. I had no idea if he was alive. The man who sat across from me in that diner was maybe 40, dark hair going gray at the temples. He had the kind of face that looked like it had weathered something. Not old exactly, but settled. He was wearing a gray fleece jacket, and he had a ceramic coffee mug already in his hand, which meant he had been there before I noticed him. He said it again, "I know who that boy is." I set down my coffee, very carefully, the way you set things down when your hands have started shaking and you don't want anyone to know. "Excuse me," I said. "The boy in the photo you've been looking at since I walked in." He nodded toward my hands. "I know who he is." I looked around the diner. Tuesday morning, 8:30. 2 women at the counter with laptops. An old man near the window reading the paper. The waitress refilling the coffee station. Nobody was paying attention to us. "Who are you?" I asked. He put down his mug. He looked at me directly, and there was something in the way he did it. Not aggressive, not manipulative, just very, very careful, that made my stomach go sideways. "My name is Ezra," he said, "and I think you might be my father. I want to tell you that I immediately knew. That something ancient and biological kicked in, and I felt the truth in my bones before he said another word. That's what the movies tell you happens. That is not what happened. What happened is that I thought he was a con man. I had been approached before, twice in fact, once in 2001 by a woman who claimed her nephew matched Connor's description, and once in 2011 by a man who said he had information about the disappearance and wanted $2,500 for it. That second one I reported to the FBI. Nothing came of it. So when Ezra said what he said, my first instinct was not hope. It was a door slamming shut. "I'm going to need you to leave," I said. He didn't move. He reached into the inside pocket of his fleece and pulled out a folded piece of paper and set it on the table between us without unfolding it. "I'm not asking you for anything," he said. "I just need to know if what I was told is true." "What were you told?" He looked down at the folded paper. "That I was taken. That the family I grew up with wasn't my real family. That my father, my biological father, spent years trying to find me." He paused. "I was told this 3 months ago, when the woman I called my grandmother was dying." I didn't touch the paper. Not yet. "What's on that?" I asked. "A name," he said. "The name she gave me. She said it was the name of the boy I used to be." The diner was very loud suddenly. The espresso machine, a burst of laughter from the two women at the counter, the old man coughing, all of it pressing in at once. "What name?" I said. He unfolded the paper and turned it to face me. It said, "Connor." I cannot describe what the next hour felt like. I will try. It felt like standing in a room where the floor has disappeared, but you haven't fallen yet. You're just standing there, in the air, waiting. We talked. He talked, mostly. I listened. I asked questions when I could form them. He had grown up in a town called Millburg in central Pennsylvania, about 6 hours from Dayton. His family, the people he knew as his family, was named the Carvers. Bernard and Lois Carver. Bernard had died in 2015. Lois, the grandmother, had died 3 months ago at 82, which was when she told Ezra the truth from her hospital bed in what she described as a deathbed confession, though Ezra said it felt more like she was relieving herself of a burden than genuinely repenting. Ezra had been told his whole life that he was adopted through a private arrangement when he was an infant. No agency, no paperwork trail that led anywhere useful. He'd accepted it. He had a good childhood by his account. Bernard was a mechanic. Lois taught Sunday school. There were cousins, holidays, Little League. He had grown up into a normal life. He worked in IT. He had a wife named Dana, 2 kids in elementary school. Then his grandmother looked at him from her hospital bed and said, "I need to tell you something about where you came from, and I need you to forgive me." She told him that Bernard's brother, a man named Ted Carver who had died in 2006, had brought Ezra to them when he was barely 4 years old. She said Ted had told them the boy's parents didn't want him anymore. She said she had believed that, or had let herself believe it, because she and Bernard had wanted a child for so long and the boy was right there and he seemed like a gift. She said she wasn't sure she believed the story even at the time. She gave him the name Connor. She said she didn't know the last name. She said she was sorry. Ezra spent 3 months searching. He found news archives from 1993 in Dayton. He found Connor Briggs, my son, my boy in the orange jacket. He found my name. And then he found me. I asked him how. How did he find me specifically, sitting in this specific diner on this specific Tuesday? He said he had found my address through property records. He'd driven to Dayton 2 weeks ago and sat outside my house trying to work up the nerve. He'd followed me, and he said this with obvious discomfort knowing how it sounded, to the diner where I came every Tuesday morning, because he'd watched long enough to know it was a routine. He said he almost turned back 4 times. "Why didn't you?" I asked. He looked at the photo of Connor that was still on the table between us. "Because I have a 4-year-old son," he said, and I kept thinking, if he disappeared tomorrow and 30 years later someone knew where he was and didn't tell me, I don't think I could survive that. I had to look away from him then, out the window, at the parking lot, at nothing. A 4-year-old son. I had a grandson I didn't know existed. We agreed to get DNA test. His idea, actually. He brought it up before I did, which I later understood was deliberate. He wanted me to know he wasn't after anything. No inheritance, no money. I am not a wealthy man. I have a house that's paid off, a pension, and a savings account that would not impress anyone. He knew this. He'd done his homework. He just wanted to know if it was true. We used one of the standard consumer DNA services and also agreed to a separate clinical test through a lab in Columbus because I wanted something that would hold up. I am a careful man. I spent 31 years waiting for the truth, and I wasn't going to take a shortcut at the finish line. The wait was 11 days. I want to tell you about those 11 days because I think they deserve to be named. They were the strangest days of my life. Stranger in some ways than the days immediately after Connor disappeared, because back then I had action to take. Talking to police, making flyers, driving routes, doing something. These 11 days I just had to sit inside the possibility. I called my sister Patrice on day 2 and told her. She cried for 10 minutes straight and then said, "I always felt he was alive. I always felt it." I didn't tell her that I had not always felt that there had been years, long years, when I had given up hoping and started only grieving. I looked at Ezra's face in my mind constantly, trying to find Connor in it. He had darker coloring than I remembered, but children change, and Joanne's family were all dark-haired. His hands, when they'd been on the table, had the same shape as my hands. Wide palm, short fingers. I am not a man who puts much stock in mystical signs, but I noticed the hands. On day 8, I called Joanne. I hadn't spoken to her in 4 years, not since her mother's funeral. She answered on the second ring, and when I told her what had happened, there was a silence on the line so long I thought the call had dropped. Then she said, "Tell me everything." The results came back on a Thursday morning. I was at home. I had the email open on my laptop and I sat in front of it for probably 7 minutes before I clicked. 99.98% probability of biological paternity. I sat at my kitchen table and I didn't move for a long time. My coffee went cold. The furnace clicked on and off. A truck went by outside. Ordinary Thursday morning sounds, going on without any awareness of what had just happened at my kitchen table. I called Ezra. He answered immediately. I think he had been waiting. I said, "It's you." And he said, and I will remember this until I die, he said, "Okay." Just that. Just okay. In a voice that sounded like a man who had been holding his breath for 40 years, finally letting it out. What came next was not simple. I want to be honest about that because I think stories like mine sometimes get told as if the reunion is the ending. It's not the ending. It's a different beginning, and different beginnings are hard. Ezra had to deal with his own grief. The family he'd grown up in, Bernard and Lois, the cousins, the holidays, the Little League, none of that was a lie, exactly. It was real love, real memory, but it had been built on something wrong, and he had to figure out how to hold both of those things at once. I watched him struggle with that. I tried not to push. There was also the matter of Ted Carver. Ted, the man who had brought Ezra to the Carver family, had died in 2006. But he had a son still living, a man in his 50s named Boyd, who lived in Scranton. I went with Ezra to speak to him. Boyd knew more than he initially admitted. After 2 conversations, the second one with a lawyer present, it came out that Ted had been part of a crew doing courier work for a man connected to the organized crime case my father-in-law had presided over in 1992. The theory investigators had circled back then about the kidnapping being retaliatory had been right. Ted had not acted alone. He'd been paid. By the time we had this information, the people who had ordered it were either dead or incapacitated. The statute of limitations had complicated what charges, if any, could be brought. A federal investigator I spoke to said the case was being reviewed, but was honest with me that outcomes were unlikely. I had to make a decision about whether to be consumed by that. I decided not to be. Not because I'm a saint, because I have a grandson named Caleb, who is 4 years old and has a gap between his 2 front teeth, and I am not going to spend whatever time I have left staring backward. I called Joanne when the legal situation was clearer. She had a right to know. She drove up from Columbus. She and Walt live there now. and she sat at my kitchen table, and I showed her the DNA results, and she held the photo of Connor and the photo of Ezra side by side for a long time without saying anything. Then she said, "He has your hands." I said, "I know." She met Ezra 2 weeks later. I was not there for that. I think that was right. Some things need space to happen without an audience. She called me that evening and said it had gone well. She said she'd cried and he'd cried, and his wife Dana had brought coffee, and they'd sat at a kitchen table in central Pennsylvania and talked for 3 hours. She said, "He's a good man. You should be proud." I said I was. I said I'd been proud of him for 31 years without knowing anything about him, which sounds irrational, but felt true. There are things I still think about at night. I think about the 4-year-old Connor was when he was taken. Whether he was scared, what he was told. Lois had said Ted told them the boy's parents didn't want him, which means Ezra grew up with some version of that story underneath everything. He says he doesn't remember being explicitly told that it was more of a background hum, an absence of story. But I think about it. I think about what it does to a child, even a child who grows up in a loving home, to have that absence under everything. We talked about it, he and I, on the phone, and now in person. We've started having Sunday dinners, just monthly for now, because we both agreed not to rush. His kids call me Mr. Tom, not Grandpa yet. Maybe someday. We're not hurrying. I think about my father-in-law who died in 2010, who never knew, who carried the guilt of believing his work had cost his daughter her son. I think about Joanne's mother who grieved differently, quietly, in that way some women of her generation did, folding everything inward and carrying it to her own grave. I think about all of it. But mostly lately, on Thursday nights after bowling, I sit on my front porch, even when it's cold, and I look at the street where not very much happens, and I think about the fact that there's a small boy in Pennsylvania who has a gap between his front teeth, same as his father did, same as his grandfather does, and the world is a strange and occasionally merciful place. 31 years is a long time to wait for something. I didn't think I'd live to see it. I did. I keep coming back to something Lois said from her hospital bed. She said she wasn't sure she had believed Ted's story even at the time. She just let herself believe it because she wanted to. That sentence has stayed with me more than almost anything else from this whole experience, because I think most of the damage in this story, 31 years of it, came not from one dramatic act of evil, but from a series of small choices people made to look away. Ted told a lie. Lois accepted it without asking hard enough. Bernard didn't ask either. Everyone found a reason not to look too closely at a 4-year-old boy who had appeared in their lives without documentation or explanation. And I lost my son. I'm not saying this to condemn them. Lois is gone. Bernard is gone. Ted is gone. Condemnation doesn't do anything useful now. I'm saying it because I think it matters to understand how things actually break, not with a single catastrophic moment, but with accumulated small surrenders of honesty, the willingness to know something is probably wrong and decide not to examine it. That's where the rot starts. Ezra spent 3 months doing what none of those adults had done. He had just been handed the most destabilizing information a person can receive, that his entire understanding of where he came from was false, and instead of shutting down, instead of deciding it was too complicated or too painful, he thought it through carefully, and then he acted. He drove to Dayton. He sat in his car outside my house 4 times before he walked in. He could have turned back. He had every justification to turn back. But he had the clarity to understand that the truth, however difficult, was better than comfortable uncertainty. That kind of clear-headedness under pressure is not common. I don't take it for granted. And then there is the question of what it cost him to do it right. He didn't come to me with accusations. He didn't come demanding. He came with a folded piece of paper and a DNA test already in mind, and he said, "I'm not asking you for anything. I just need to know if what I was told is true." That is a particular kind of character, the kind that can hold its own pain steady enough to think about someone else's. He was sitting across from a man who might be his father, carrying 31 years of loss, and Ezra was careful with that. He was decent about it. I noticed. What I've learned. What this entire experience has ground into me is that endurance is not the same as passivity. I waited 31 years, but I didn't stop. I kept the photo. I kept the photo with the detective's old contact information. I kept paying attention. There were years when Holt felt genuinely foolish, when holding on seemed like a failure to accept reality. I held on anyway, not out of delusion, but because letting go felt like a betrayal of the boy in the orange jacket. That stubbornness, that refusal to close the file, that is what made it possible for Ezra to find me. He needed me to still be findable. Caleb has a gap between his front teeth. He doesn't know yet what that gap connects him to. Someday he will. I hope when he hears this story, he understands that the people who came before him, his father most of all, chose honesty when it was hard, held steady when it was easier to drift, and treated other people's pain with enough care to slow down and think before acting. That's all I'd want him to take from it, really. Not the kidnapping, not the courtrooms, not the 31 years. Just that.